Hi everyone, thanks for attending. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week's webinar is cool language features for Xojo. And we got some pretty good attendance today, so it sounds like something everyone has been pretty interested in. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to go through a bunch of different projects that demonstrate, as you can see, the features I mentioned here. So we're going to cover extension methods, method assignment, operator overloading, operator lookup, briefly look at attributes, and then we'll also look at enumerations. If you have any questions while I'm talking, feel free to just type them into the question window. They'll pop up on my other screen, and I'll either address them right away or when it's appropriate or when I remember to look. But if you think of a question, just type it in right away so you don't forget it. All right, so let's get started here. The first one we're going to take a look at is extension methods. This is probably my favorite out of all of these because I use it the most. But let's see how it works. So what is an extension method? It is a way for you to add or appear to add a method to an existing class or something that's already in Xojo or even your own stuff. Now it's really kind of what is termed syntactic sugar, which means it's just a different way of writing things so it looks more object oriented that you could do otherwise with just a global method. But because of the syntax and whatnot, it is just too darn cool. So let's take a look at this window here. So I'm going to show a variety of methods here. I've got a bunch of extension methods that are in here, and we'll look at each of them one at a time. But let me just run the project so you can see what it does. Now this one doesn't do anything too exciting. It's just adding a value. But you'll see how that is done using the extension method. This calculates the days between two dates. This one adds an extension method that allows you to search a list box if I didn't have a bug in it. But anyway, we will now look at the extension methods themselves. I think I was supposed to search on the last name, not the first name. Anyway, let's look at the add extension method. Actually, I want to look at the syntax first so you can see what these things do. So normally, and this comes up a lot on the forums, you want to add a value to an integer. You type, pretty simple. You type I equals I plus 1. Well, some people are terribly fond of the I++ syntax that you see in C-like languages, which Xojo does not have, probably never will have. But you can kind of simulate that a little bit by using an extension method. And you can see I have right here, I create an extension method called add. And I can type I, which is an integer value, dot add, and it will add a value to it. I have it set up so if you don't supply a parameter, it just adds 1. So this essentially is equivalent to I equals I plus 1. And I also set up so it will accept a parameter, and you could just specify the value in the parameter. So this would be equivalent to I equals I plus 5. This is a little example of what an extension method can do. Now, integer is not even a class, so we're adding essentially these what look like properties or methods to a built-in type. So that's pretty cool. So let's look at what this looks like. First of all, extension methods always go in a module. You can't put them in a class, you can't put them in a window, you can't put them anywhere else. They have to go in a module, and they have to have a scope of global. You give it a name, just like you would normally give it a name. And then you use the extends keyword in the parameter list. And the type you're dealing with has to be the first parameter. So here I have I as integer. And then you can have additional parameters if you want. This particular one's also being set as byref so that we can just modify this and it's not actually returning a value. So you can see the code is ridiculously simple. It's just doing the add for you. But the syntax of the extension method is what the magic happens. Because normally, you could, if you could certainly write this like this. Whoops, so I get the cursor in the right place. I could just write You can't write it. I mean, I could have made just a global method, put it in a module somewhere, and then I could write code like that, but that doesn't look as nice. And that's why I said it's kind of considered syntactic sugar, because essentially that syntax for declaring your parameters allows you to, instead of typing this, type this. If I leave the extends off, then it would go back to the normal method where I would use the add with the parameters just in parentheses one after another. Now this technique is very, very simple, but it can be used in many, many ways that is just so handy that you're going to start using it immediately after you see how this works if you're not already using it. So, and because it acts as a method call, you can use it anywhere that you would normally use a method call. So, anywhere that it makes sense, it'll work. You could use it in another call to another method. I think I got a question here. Can it be used in a for next loop? For I dot add to 20. Well, that would probably be a little weird, but maybe. I don't know. We'd have to try that. But let's take a look at some of these other ones that we have here. Let's see. What else do I have on here? Oh, the days apart. I didn't rename that button. So this one calls an extension method that has been added to date, and it calculates the days between two dates. So here I'm just creating one date of looks like September 21st, and then I calculate how many days away that is from whatever the current date is. So let's look at days apart. Now you can see the syntax over here in the parameter list. Again, extends is the important thing to remember in all of this, is the extends keyword that you add to the first parameter. And that means that it allows you to use the first parameter essentially in dot notation. And then you can have whatever the heck you want in here. The first parameter is the date. So you can use it however you want. This particular code is just calculating the total seconds, subtracting them, and then dividing out to get the days. And then returning whatever the absolute value is. But, like you can make these things do whatever you want. It probably would be useful to maybe not have this be absolute value so you knew if it was before or after the other date, but it doesn't really matter. The interesting thing here is that if the second date ends up being nil, it's raising an exception. You could certainly, and I did that because otherwise, because it's returning an integer, what would be considered a value that's not reasonable? I could have returned a negative value because, we're calculating absolute here. So then that could be, well, if the value is less than 0, then that's error of some sort. But in this case, I said, well, why not just raise an exception? So this is just another little example here of how you can see you can raise your own exceptions and give them their own messages and bring them up. So you create the exception, give it a custom message, and raise it up. So that's how days apart works. And again, you can see, very nice, clean syntax. This is the sort of thing where if you find you're doing stuff repeatedly, it's a great way to add things to built-in classes. And you don't have to subclass. So it keeps things a little simpler from your project structure. And another great use of this is if you're coming from another language and you're maybe used to a particular syntax construct that it has that might be a little different in Xojo, and maybe you find that you keep typing the old way because that's what you used to use. Well, you can create an extension method and change it. So you can see here I added a toString extension method because .NET uses toString to convert integers to strings, whereas Xojo uses the str global method. So this, doesn't do anything terribly sophisticated, but it now would, I don't know if I have example here, but I'll just type something here at the bottom. Oh yeah, I'm using it right here in this message box. So I'm just typing the variable name, that's the integer, and then putting .toString at the end. And if I happen to be a VB programmer that just moved over to Xojo, this might be something that would prevent me from making a lot of compilation errors by using something that doesn't exist. Let's see, you got some other handy ones in here. Quoting. I often find when I'm writing code, particularly, it could be anything, you sometimes need to quote things. Well, managing all the quotes you need to get it right, because you got to double quotes within the quotes. It's easy to make a mistake. You end up with a syntax error. You got to jump back to your code to fix it. Well, just create a quick extension method. Boom, don't have to worry about it. And then you just call string.doublequote, and it returns back a properly quoted string. And I got the same thing here for single quote. Again, I find in many of my projects, I often have many of these extension method modules. One thing that I tend to do when I'm designing them is I create a new module for maybe the class that I am extending with methods. So I might create a module here, and whoops, click on the right name. That doesn't look right at all. Did I add that to something? Oh, I added it to the extension method. I didn't want to add it there. I just wanted a global module. There we go. So I might create a module and just call it string extensions, and then I'll put all my string extensions in this one module. And if I have date extensions, I'll create another module called date extension. It allows me to group things a little better so I know what goes with what. Here I just put a bunch of unrelated ones together for ease of viewing. But often in my projects, I have a variety of these extension methods for various things. Let's look at the find one. This was the one with the bug. And this one is extending a list box and adding a find method that will essentially search through the list box. And, oh, there we go. I'm supposed to specify the column. And it will, so it'll search for the text that you typed in whatever column you specify and then select the row. This is a fairly common thing that you tend to do with list boxes. So I said, well, let's try that as an extension method. So you can see it's extending the list box, and then it's accepting two other parameters, the text to find and the column to look for. And if we go to the code here, it searches for what was typed and using column 1. So if I run that with the right, I don't have any great error checking these things. So it was searching the last name column. So I actually should put something in here that exists so that it will find it and select it. And you can see it selected the row. What I apparently neglected to do is if I put something in that column that's not found, it throws an out of bounds exception, and that isn't good. So I should check for that and either highlight nothing, which might make the most sense for this particular method. Again, it depends on what you need for your implementation, or even raising an exception. That maybe raising the out of bound exception might make sense. I don't particularly think so, but nonetheless, that's how you would implement something like that, extending the list box with whatever values you need. And there's just an example of another one here. This is also based on the .NET language, which has contains available for strings. And this Xojo uses the instr method to do that. Contains generally returns just a true or false. In-string tells you exactly where the string was found. So, this little tweak does that. It just checks, was it found? Yes, no. And it allows you to continue using syntax that, thank you, someone, even though I didn't leave the screen up for very long, I forgot to count properly. So when it's not found, it's going all the way to the end of the list and beyond the end of the list. So bug fixed. Thank you. I'll make sure that it's saved when I include these in the next version of Xojo. So like I said, you're bound to have, as you think about this, you're probably already like, oh my God, great ways to add things. And it's a very handy way to add things to classes. You don't want to bother subclassing, to built-in types that you can't subclass, like integer or string. You probably could subclass date, I guess, but this is just a lot more convenient than trying to deal with that. So yeah, you definitely want to take a look at extension methods. It's a great feature. It's actually been in Xojo for many, many years. A long time. I remember it was added to Xojo And at the time I was still doing .NET development. And I remember, I think it was when C# 3.0 came out, there was a big item on the feature list that said, we now have extension methods. This is great. And I remember writing a blog post way back then, this was years ago, that, even at the time, it had been in Xojo, and I think it was real basic at the time, for at least several years before it even got added to .NET. So this is just a really cool feature. Most languages these days have it, and you definitely want to take a look at it and see how it can help make your projects cleaner and easier to work with. All right, I'm just going to scan the question list for anything. I got a couple here, but I'm going to try and save those to the end because they're not directly related to what I'm covering right now. So let's move on to the next example project I have here. So I got a few of them. And this one is method assignment. It's one we want to take a look at. Now, if you're probably aware, and if you're not, we'll cover that a little bit as well, of something called computed properties that are in Xojo in most languages. Now, I don't actually have one here, so I'm going to add one. Now, a computed property, we'll give it a name, has two parts to it, a getter and a setter. And a computed property is, like its name says, it computes the value and then returns it or does something with it, depending on whether you're getting or setting. And getting would be, I equals computed property, and setting would be computed property equals value. You can create read-only computed properties by only implementing the get part, and you can create strange write-only computed properties by only implementing the set part, but that's rather unusual. Or you can just implement both, and you can have a property that behaves as a normal property. The benefit of doing this is you can have a bunch of code in here, so you can do multiple things. And this is all great. I use computed properties all the time. But there's another thing you can do, and has a little advantage to doing it, is something called method assignment. It allows you to create a method on something, a window or a class or whatnot. And of course, you can do it with a module as well, that behaves as if you're assigning a value to it rather than passing it in as an argument. So you can see here, this little method is called current user. And all it's going to do is change the title bar to say whatever was passed in as the user. But if you look at the parameter, you can see there's this keyword here, this mysterious magical keyword called assigns. And this, again, is kind of a syntactic sugar thing. But if we run this, you'll see that it actually does that. And if we look at the code, you'll see that it's written like this, and not like this, which is how you might normally expect it if that assigns keyword was not there. So it's a little bit of syntactic sugar that allows you to write something that looks as if it were a property, even though behind the scenes it's really a method. Now, why is this better than using a computed property? Well, in most cases, it's not. It actually predates the computed properties in the language. But the one case where it is better than using a computed property is when you're dealing with inheritance or whatnot. In the Xojo language, subclasses have access to the methods and the properties or whatnot of their superclass. But methods are all virtual, so you can override them. You can call their supers. You can use them in interfaces. But you can't do that with properties. Even though a subclass will have access to the property, it can't override the property. So if you're depending on your API design, there may be situations where you want to have something that looks like a property. You want to make it available so a subclass could possibly override it. In that case, you'll want to implement it in this manner. The other difference between the two is that if you're using a computed property, the value shows in the debugger. If you're using one of these methods the assignment methods. Because it's a method, the value is not shown in the debugger. So that's another little difference there. Again, to me, that makes computer properties more useful. And by and large, I find that I use computer properties more often than assignment methods. But there are certain special cases where an assignment method is exactly what you need, and these are how they work. And another example of how one works here is on this status bar control. So you can see how one works. It has a little bit of code in it. So if we go back to this code here, you can see here we're calling this text property, and we're assigning it a value. And this does point out another example of when an assignment method is more useful than a computer property, is you can't create a computer property that accepts a parameter, essentially. That just doesn't work. But this works because it's really a method. And it's really a method that would have, this would be the first parameter, and this would actually be the second one. But it looks a little cleaner like this. So that's another reason why an assignment method can be handy. And you'd probably be surprised at how many things that look like properties on the built-in Xojo framework are actually implemented in this manner. Things like listbox.cell, for example. But anyway, you can see it's assigning this here. So if you look at this, you can see how the syntax is set up. The assigns parameter has to always be the last one in the list, and all your other ones go first. And the ones that appear first, you can pass in as parameters between parentheses, and the assignments one is the one that's assigned using the equal sign at the very end. So you can see here, this particular thing is just setting a position value. It can be 0, 1, or 2 to indicate where on the status bar to show the text. It assigns that to a little array, and then it just tells this little status bar canvas to refresh itself. And I believe this just updates something on the bottom. Yeah, so I'm passing in a 2, which means right adjust it, and that's how you can build. That's just an example of a little custom control that could be used to show status information at the bottom of a window. But it shows you how this assignment method can be used with that sort of thing. And you can see the assignment method is using a property behind the scenes to store the value, and then it's actually essentially forcing a redraw of the item, which actually draws the thing in the canvas. All right, I'm just going to run over here and check any questions related to this stuff. There's a question about can these methods simulate a getter? Well, yeah, you can always do that, because what is a getter for a method? It's just the method itself. It's a function. So if I went to current user and I wanted to have a getter that returned the current user, I would just add a method also called current user, and I would have it return a string. And I'm not actually, normally if you're going to return a value, you have to have somewhere to get it. But in this case, I can just return that. So then I can write code that looks like that. And then, this is actually a method call. Because there's no parameters or anything, it essentially looks the same as a property. But you can certainly do the pairs to simulate setters and getters that way using methods. There's a question here: can you use the assigns inside the parentheses, or does it have to follow the equal sign? Well, when you set up your method using the assigns keyword, that means that this argument has to follow the equal sign when it's used. So because the current user method has the because it has the assignment, I have to write it like this. If I left off the assigns keyword, I would just write it like this. but you can't have it both ways. So like I was saying, the extension methods, no, sorry, these aren't extension methods. I already did those. The assignment methods are very handy in specific situations. I'd say most of the time you're probably going to want to stick with computed properties, but when you run into these special cases where if you need to deal with subclasses and allow the overriding, or you're creating an interface that you want to make sure has a specific thing implemented, then assignment methods can be useful. And also if you have something that essentially you want to act as a property but also accepts a value, assignment methods can help you do that. All right, so let's move on to another project. And let's see what we've got to choose from here. Let's look at operator overload. Now, built into Xojo is a bunch of ways you can overload operators. And the main reason to do this is when you're dealing with classes, so that you can specify that some syntax does something useful, which may or may not be appropriate depending on your class. But as the example I'm going to show you here, I have a customer class here, and it has some properties just to store some information. Now, if I want to check if, search for something in this class, the most obvious way is I would search and match the property. But what if I wanted to write syntax that looked like this, what you see in this line here, if C equals some text that was typed in? Well, what the heck is C? C is a class. So I'm saying, all right, if the class equals some text, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it makes sense in this case because I overloaded the comparison operator for the customer class so that it returns text, or so that it compares text. And that allows me to control what text it's comparing. So let's take a look at that. So there's special methods you can implement on your classes that will give you access to these overloading things. And this is the one for comparisons, operator compare. There's also ones in there for adding and subtracting and multiplying and all that sort of stuff, which probably less useful, except again for very specific cases. But comparing is often useful. So here I've said that I want to allow a comparison between the object itself and something else. And the other thing I want to compare it with happens to be a string. And operator compare always returns an integer, and that integer value contains the result of the comparison. So here, what I want to compare with the value that's passed in my case, is the first and last name that are properties on here. Now this makes it a little easier because those happen to be separate properties, and I'm putting a little space in them. So if I wanted to do this, another way that I could write this would be if c.firstName, and it'd probably be better to put this in a string. So then I would probably want to do, name equals c.firstName plus c, or plus a space, plus c.lastName. And then I'd write code that said if name equals name field.text. So these two lines are essentially the equivalent of what the code in the operator compare is doing here. This is certainly a lot simpler to read, maybe not quite as obvious as this, but it also does give you the benefit of being able to tweak the code in here in your operator compare more easily than if you had this sort of code scattered throughout your application. So going back here, this could essentially be whatever the heck we wanted. If it turned out we needed to add a middle name in here as well, we could just add that and it wouldn't really affect how the comparisons are done. And then you just check if, you compare them yourself. So I'm comparing the two strings here, and then you return the value. So if the value that came in happens to be less than the value we're comparing, we return a 1. If they match, we return a 0. And then otherwise, we return -1, which means they're greater. And that's it. That's how you implement an operator comparison. And it allows you to use syntax like this, where you're comparing a class to, in this particular case, piece of string. You could certainly compare a class to a class in this way. So if I wanted to compare two customers are equal, I could choose to compare, I don't know, whatever information might be considered unique. It could be their names. It could be a customer ID if I happen to have a customer ID on this class. And that would allow you to compare if two things are equal, even if they happen to be two different instances of the class, for example. Now again, operator overloading is pretty advanced. I don't tend to use this a heck of a lot in projects, but sometimes something comes up where it makes sense to do so. And the reason you don't, like all these things I'm showing you here today, there's always going to be another way to do them. With extension methods, there was, just create a global method. That was the alternative. Just didn't look as nice. Assignment methods is the same sort of thing. You could just use computer properties, or you could just use methods however you did before, but it just doesn't look as nice. And this is the same sort of thing here. This gives you perhaps a simpler syntax in your code. But like you saw here, you could have probably done it yourself by extracting out the information you needed and doing the comparison the old-fashioned way. So it's not like these things are bringing brandy new capabilities to your apps. They're just attempting to simplify the way that you write them. Let's see, there's a question here. Doesn't a comparison in an if need to return a Boolean? Yes, well, it definitely returns a Boolean. The comparison is returning a Boolean. If you have to think of this as when I'm using C here in the equal comparison, it's actually returning what you see here. And then this value gets compared with this, and that comparison returns a Boolean. All right, let's look at one of the other operator overload type things. It's not really an overload, but it's related. And this one is pretty cool, and it's called operator lookup. Now I have a class here, and it's got one property on it. It's just a private property of a dictionary, which I, very cleverly called M dictionary. And just for reference, you often see private properties of classes prefixed with an M, like this. And the M, is kind of a historical, but it stands for member, and it means that this particular property is only accessible to the member, which is the class itself. So you just as an FYI, so you often do see that syntax in example code. So what this code does is it's going to create a couple instances of this class, or create an instance of this class, and then show you the value of the name. Now, if you look at this class, and we'll explain in the methods here, you'll see there's no method or property called name. Nothing. There's a constructor and there's an operator lookup. The constructor just populates the dictionary with some names, as you can see here. Actually one name and some other properties. So you might think, well, run this, you're going to get a compile error. That's normally what you'd expect. I typed in a method or property, it doesn't exist. I'm going to get a compile error. Well, no, not in this case. And that's because we've implemented operator lookup, which essentially means that the operator lookup method is going to get passed in this value right here, or this value right here. Anything that's typed after the dot that doesn't match to an existing method or property on the class is going to get sent along to operator lookup, and you'll get these values in here. And what operator lookup is doing in this case is it's checking the dictionary to see if it has a key for this particular value and returning the result. So you see here, we created a dictionary, we put a key in called name, and it has a name in here. So if I run this project, you'll see it return that name. And then I have it return just a message if it didn't find essentially the property that you typed there. Now this is a pretty powerful feature. It's essentially bringing you almost complete dynamic capability to Xojo, if you will, because none of these things are going to be checked at runtime or at compile time anymore. I can type, as you can see with this one, I type whatever the heck I want. Now you won't get autocomplete, obviously, because you can type whatever you want. So that means infinity autocompletes, right? I mean, I could type my name. It doesn't matter. It'll still run, as it's no longer checking for that class whether the properties exist, because it's saying I don't need to, because at runtime I'm just sending that stuff along to the operator lookup method. Let's look at this a little bit more closely. Again, it's a special magic method name, operator underscore lookup. And you can declare it however the heck you want. I'm sending in a value. Well, you have to always pass in the value of what was typed after the dot. But what it returns can be whatever makes sense. So here I'm checking if the dictionary has a key for whatever happened to be typed in after the dot. And if it does, I return the value that's in the dictionary. And if it doesn't have the key, I'm returning just a custom string that says, well, I didn't find anything for that value. And you could do whatever you wanted here. We could be raising an exception here. We could go look it up somewhere else. If we had multiple dictionaries, we could go scan a bunch of them. We have multiple places where we had data. One case where I tend to use this in a lot of apps is in database code. You can have a class that happens to be named after a table in your database. And then rather than creating properties or methods for every column in the database, you can use operator lookup and then look them up at runtime. It's pretty handy. It allows you to tweak your database design and not really have to go back and change the class. And I'm sure there's plenty of other examples where this thing is handy too, but you want to use this a little bit carefully because, like I said, it does turn off essentially the checking, the compile time checking of properties and methods. So then you run into, you lose some of the benefit of Xojo, which is it's type safety and type checking, and you end up more with a language that is going to throw you errors at runtime. So you have to be a lot more careful because no one likes to see runtime errors, especially on silly things. So if I had made a mistake here and I accidentally called this names, and let's get rid of these other two, those are obvious bad examples. But say I'm just happen to be coding away and I make a typo or I space it and I forget the property is actually called name and I type names. Well, I'm not going to get a compile error like I would if that were a real property. And you wouldn't notice that you actually have an error in your app at all until you attempt to access that property. In this particular case, it's going to come up and say there's no value. But if you don't have adequate error handling around this, you could end up creating bad data in your app or something like that, because it could insert a blank value or display a value you didn't expect or something like that. So you have to be very careful when using this, but it can be incredibly cool and useful when you do need it. And this is perhaps one example of something that you can't really do using alternative means. There's no other way to get really the value that's after the dot. The alternative syntax for this would be, I suppose, you would write C dot something like this. But still, this method name you'd have to declare yourself, and then you'd just be passing in something like that. So, that's one workaround, but this is a heck of a lot cleaner and easier to read and write, and I like it. So that's operator lookup. That's a fun one to play with. So certainly dig around with that one. Let's see, you got any questions on this one? Does a parameter passed to operator lookup have to be a string, or can it be a variant? Well, I don't recall if it has to be a string. It probably should be a string because whatever's after the dot is essentially a string. We can try changing this and seeing if that has any effect, really. But it's just going to get converted. Yeah, I mean, what's after the dot is a string itself. So a variant can contain a string. If we, tried to do something, well, that's going to cause a variety of errors because of the code, so that won't work. But yeah, I mean, normally you're just going to want the value coming in as a string because that's what the value is, a string. All right, let's get a couple more, or maybe more than a couple more little examples. So let's move on. Before I do that, because I keep forgetting, and the marketing folks like to remind me, I have a poll that I'm supposed to run. So I'm going to run that for you guys to look at while I get the next project ready here. It should be pretty short. All right, I'm going to check this poll status here. I have no idea if you can see my screen and the poll at the same time. I don't exactly see the same things you guys are seeing in this case. All right, I got a response that says, no, you cannot see my screen while the poll is up. So I'll give, let's see, 10 more seconds, then I'm closing the poll. See if we can get everybody to vote. All righty, we'll close the poll here. All right, should see my screen up here. This is an example that shows off enumerations. And enumerations are essentially very, very similar to using constants for values, except that they're collected together and they're not just random values. So it allows you to, again, to have one of the main features of Xojo, which is some sort of type checking, so that you can ensure that you're only using a value that makes sense. So if you run this here, you're not going to do too much. There's just three different statuses that are in this dropdown. These statuses are technically enumerations, not what's displayed here, but how they're set and used behind the scenes. Then when you click the button, it's just using checking the enumerated value, or checking the value in the enumeration and then displaying an appropriate message. So the running the app doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. Looking at the code ought to be a little bit more interesting. So enumerations, you add an enumeration just by choosing right here, enumeration. And then you get the enumeration editor, and you give it a name. The type is always integer. You don't want to be messing around with that, even though that field is editable. And then you add your enumeration values here, and you just give them names. Behind the scenes, they are integers. You can actually cast them to integers should you need to get access to the value, which can sometimes be useful if you're saving this to a database or something like that. And you can even specify a specific value if that matters to you. I forget the syntax, but I think you do it like this. But that's rarely necessary. But this means that now, rather than having, say 3 constants, say k active, k closed, and k pending, that are just the values 1, 2, 3, the enumeration forces it to be these 3 values. So if I were to set it to a different value, or even or just to try to set it to an integer, I get a compilation error. So you can see this is how you set them. Here in the change event for the pop-up, I'm just checking which one happened to be set. And you can see right here, there's actually a property called status value that is type is set as the enumeration. So status is the name of the enumeration. I created a property and I set its type to status. This means I can assign it one of the enumeration values. So let's just get rid of that so you can see what it looks like in the autocomplete. So I type the name of the enumeration, I press the dot, now I can press tab, and you can see these are the only choices I have, active, closed, or pending. I can't just say, status value equals 45 here. I get an error. There's a type mismatch error. Again, strength of Xojo, the type safety here. It's telling you, it's just not going to cut it. And if I type something here that doesn't make sense because it's not actually one of the enumerated values, I get the same thing. I mean, that's not a value that exists. So it protects you from yourself and allows you to make sure that you're setting values that you expect and things don't get set to things you don't expect. So this is how you set values using enumerations, and it's just comparisons. It looks a lot like maybe a class with constants on it. You could certainly create your own class or module that was called status, that had constants on it with these names, and you could be comparing them. But that wouldn't give you the type safety because these would all essentially be integers or some other value, and they could just, you could circumvent the use of the enumeration by just typing in a direct integer or other value there, and then mess up your app. And then using these works again the same way that most things work. Here I'm doing a select case on the property, and I'm comparing its value using the enumeration. And then nothing too exciting here. I'm just displaying message boxes, but this could be calling off methods in your app that does all kinds of processing for when a status of something happens to get changed to pending or whatever, emailing people or doing who knows what. But the point is that the enumerations give you more precise control over values. You can, use these things anywhere. You can declare them anywhere. Often they're going to be declared in the class that is referencing them, but you can certainly put them in a module and make them global. You can use them wherever you want. But that's how they're used. That's how, you can add more. And, type whatever you want for words in here. They become available. And the editor is pretty easy to use as well. All right, I'm just going to check some questions here as a few have come up. And while I'm doing that, I'll check the time. All right. So we only got, I think, one more project to look at, and that'll be quick. There's a question here. Can the return type be variant? That might have been in reference to operator lookup. And if so, yeah, the return type on operator lookup can be whatever you want. Certainly, and as I was mentioning with operator lookup, it kind of starts to, it hides the type safety that's built into Xojo because, it catches everything essentially. And you want to be careful when using variant as well, because variant has the same problem, is you lose the type safety because a variant can hold anything. So your first choice for doing things should not be, I'll make it a variant. Your first choice should be to pick the appropriate type that contains the information you need. Variants should be used judiciously and only in specific situations that make sense. Otherwise, you just run the risk of having all kinds of type issues that you don't catch till runtime. Well, this isn't really a question, more of a comment. It'd be helpful if in the future something defined as an enumeration didn't require the typing of the enumeration first. So the suggestion is it would be kind of cool to be able to type something like this. And that might be cool, but how would you exactly know which enumeration you're referring to if you had multiple enumerations on your class that had multiple values called pending? So yeah, that might be kind of cool, but I'm not exactly sure how that would work. But certainly feel free to raise it as a feature request in feedback so the engineers can take a look at it and then tell you if that makes sense or if it's not practical. Let's see here. Is there a way to get the string value of the enumeration? No, there is no way to get the string value of the enumeration. So the enumeration here is declared. These values you cannot get as strings. You can get the integer value by casting it. So if I remember how this works, again, not something you do very often. I think maybe it goes like this. And I could be completely wrong about this. Might be something I need to look up, but yeah, it looks like I am completely wrong. Maybe I got to use C-type. And if I convert that to an integer, then I need to string it. Which one was that? All right, now I don't remember where the code was that I just did. I've set it to pending. So I just, there we go. So there we got the value. Took a little doing, but there it is. So you can get that value for what it's worth using a rather convoluted statement, but you cannot get the string. It's not in any way that I'm aware of, and I don't think it would make sense anyway because they're not strings. All right, let's take a look at the last project we have here before we run out of time. And the last one, is just going to show off a couple of the built-in attributes and show you what attributes are for. I'll just show you what these attributes are for anyway. In general, attributes are really used in conjunction with introspection. And the topic of introspection allows you to essentially query the details of the classes and its properties and methods of your app while it's running. I could probably take an entire webinar or two just to cover introspection. But here I just want to show you a couple of the cool built-in attributes you can use. So here I've created a class that I've cleverly named class with deprecated methods. So when you create a method, it's just a regular old method here, nothing special about it. Doesn't do anything. If you click the little advanced gear button up here, you get the attribute editor. And this is where you can add attributes to the method. And you can add whatever you want here. There's no restriction. That's why I said generally they're used with introspection, because you would check for the existence of a particular attribute using introspection and then have your code do something. But there are two attribute values that actually do something in Xojo, and one is called deprecated. And it allows you to indicate that a method is deprecated, and then it allows you to indicate what you should be using instead. This is very handy if you happen to be creating classes that are used by others and you want to alert them to the fact that something has been deprecated and they should use something else, again, for API design or whatnot. So you can see if I go here and I analyze my project, and that's how you see these sort of warnings. You can see I got a warning here that says deprecated item has a replacement. And we didn't look at this code yet, but I'll click on it so it comes up here. And you can see I called the calculate method, but that's the one that's marked as deprecated. So I'm getting the warning here, and it says it's deprecated. I should use calculate new instead. So this is just information, but it's one of the built-in attribute settings that you can use for your own things. Again, very specialized. You may not use it at all, but if you're creating stuff that classes or APIs that other people are using, it can become pretty handy. The other thing about deprecating it is it will prevent it from showing in the autocomplete. So you can see I'm only seeing calculate new here because that one has not been marked, whereas calculate doesn't show in the autocomplete. You can certainly type it. Deprecated stuff you can still use. It just generally you want to discourage their use. The other setting, and you'll notice here in the navigator, there's a little red A that appears next to the icon to indicate that it has an attribute. That's what that is, if you can't quite make that out. The other setting is you can actually hide things from autocomplete. And they're not deprecated, they're just hidden, so they don't show in autocomplete. And we'll go back to the attribute editor here. And you can see the same sort of thing. You just put an attribute of hidden on it. Doesn't take a value. And when you do that, that just hides the method from autocomplete. So we go back here. Again, you can see a hidden method. You can call it because it's obviously a valid method, but it doesn't show an autocomplete. The only thing that shows an autocomplete here is this method here in the middle. The deprecated one's not going to show, and the hidden one's not going to show. So again, these two things are mostly for people that are creating classes that others are using, and they want to be able to control stuff like this. But there they are. Probably in a future webinar, I think I have on my topic list is to go over introspection. And if that's something that anyone or you guys have interest in, by all means, shoot me an email so I can gauge the interest in these things. I try to do topics that are going to appeal to multiple or as many people as possible, ideally. If I only get a couple people that care about introspection, it's probably going to drop lower on the priority list. But introspection is pretty cool, and but like a lot of things that I've showed you today, they have very specific needs, and it shouldn't be your first choice for solving a particular problem. It should be used for solving particular sets of problems. All right, I think that covers all the examples I wanted to show you today for the topics. Let me just scan them. Yep. All right, so let's just see if we've got any other questions. So last question here was, so would introspection be able to find attributes? Yes, absolutely. Introspection can scan essentially any instance of a class that's at runtime, and you can get information about the class, including the methods that are on it, the properties that are on it, the attributes that are on it. You can call things dynamically that way. I think you can set values of properties dynamically that way. It's a very powerful thing. But like I said, it's very specialized. Normally, you're not going to want to need to look up the names of the methods that are on an instance of a class while your app is running. That's often used for frameworks and a lot of low-level behind-the-scenes stuff. General apps don't need that level of information. But accessing attributes can be handy. Again, one example of one might be, and you would do this introspection, if you were creating a class that mapped to a database table, say it was called person, and but say the table in the database happened to be called something else. Maybe you'd want to create an attribute here called table name, and you'd want to set its value to be, maybe in the database it's plural, so it's persons. So you might create an attribute here. It says, all right, the real table name that maps to this particular class happens to be persons, but I'm calling it person in my project. And then you'd have to use introspection at runtime to look up this attribute, find the value, and then you'd be able to use this value to find the table in the database. But yes, that's absolutely all something that introspection can do. All right, we're coming up on our 1 hour mark. Are there any other questions? As I scan the question list here, see if there's anything I may have missed. All right, well, it looks like questions are at an end. If you think of questions later or something that I didn't answer in enough detail for you, by all means, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer emails at paul@xojo.com. And I just like to show the schedule. So we start up with a bunch more webinars in September. And starting in September, so next week, I'll be doing a webinar. I'm still working on this one on building and selling your apps, and this is more of a high-level thing that talks about ways you can build your apps and ways you can sell them, and things to keep in mind to do that. Probably not a lot of Xojo-specific content in here, but it's very relevant to people that create apps with Xojo and want to sell them. And then we've got our regular monthly Q&A topic. We're going to cover the list box. I got a new example that I've created that attempts to demonstrate most of the list box and show people how to use that thing. It's pretty powerful and complicated control, so that should be interesting. And then at the end of the month, we got our intro one. And let's see what else we're dealing with here. And then into October, we've got a few more with upload and downloading files, threading. And then pretty much every month, I'm always going to try and fit in a Q&A and an intro session. So if you have other topics you want me to see, or you want to see and you want me to do, by all means, shoot me an email. So like I said, I can gauge interests. And there's another comment here. Threads are a month away. Yes, threads are a month away. I'm sorry. There are a couple blog posts and some examples on threads in the example folders with Xojo that you can refer to in the meantime as a teaser. And then when you come to the webinar, you'll be filled with all the questions you can ask, or you'll be like, oh yeah, I'm an expert now. But I guess that's it for today. I want to again thank everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.